Hi there. Last time we looked at the Iron Age, which was the last period in what is known as prehistory because there are no written records for historians to look at. We now enter the realms of history when written records abound, and one of these is Julius Caesar's own record of the Gallic Wars. Julius Caesar was a great Roman general who landed in Kent in 55 and 54 BC to attempt to crush British tribal chieftains' support for the Gauls. The first visit with just 2 legions was short-lived, ending with the taking of some hostages and pledges of loyalty from some tribal leaders. The second lasted a bit longer, and Caesar had a much bigger force with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry. A large camp was built near the landing site, and a battle was fought at a crossing of the River Thames. Eventually, treaties were agreed and hostages taken before Caesar and his whole army returned to Gaul. In 2017, archaeologists from the University of Leicester excavated a 1st century Roman fortification at Pegwell Bay on the Isle of Thanet in Kent. Other artefacts support the fact this was probably Caesar's landing place in both campaigns. Following Caesar's conquest of Gaul in 50 BC, a thriving trade developed between southeast Britain and the near continent. This trade resulted in political links and client kingship relationships between tribes in southeast Britain and the Roman world. In 43 AD, Claudius, who had become emperor following the assassination of his nephew Caligula 2 years before, led an invasion of Britain. There has been much debate over whether it was a response to a request to reinstate Verica, the exiled chief of the Atrebates tribe, or a deliberate attempt to expand the empire. Claudius was a weak emperor and certainly needed a triumph such as this to enhance his position. A series of campaigns were fought, but by 47 AD it's likely that an area south of a line from the River Humber to the Severn Estuary was under Roman control. As this line nearly follows the route of the Fosse Way, some historians have suggested that this might have been an earlier frontier, although it is unlikely to have been that clear. During the invasion, the enemy capital at Colchester, Camulodunum, had been taken and was adopted as the Roman capital, with a great temple to Claudius built there. In 60 to 61 AD, Boudica, Queen of Iceni, led a revolt which came close to expelling the Romans before being defeated. The revolt led to destruction of both Colchester and Londinium. Following the suppression of the Boudican revolt, the Roman army pushed northwards, and between 78 and 84, Agricola pushed into Caledonia, modern Scotland. In 122 AD, Emperor Hadrian visited the colony of Britannia, and the decision was made to build a wall between Bowness on Solway and Wallsend on the River Tyne. Although the Antonine Wall was built further north between the rivers Clyde and Forth in 142, by 20 years later Hadrian's Wall had been reoccupied. The Romans and their auxiliaries, their families and traders from across the empire will remain in Britain until a withdrawal around 410. Following the rebuilding after the Boudican revolt, Londinium, became the capital of the province, and roads were built to enable the Roman army to consolidate their control. Many of these started in London and are the forerunners of today's motorways and A-roads. The first of these roads to affect the Midlands were Ermine Street, originally from London to Lindum. This was later to extend to a crossing of the River Humber and then onto York and became the Great North Road. There was a branch off it called King Street, which went north from Walter Newton, Roman Dura Breve, in Cambridgeshire, and rejoined Ermine Street at Ancaster in Lincolnshire. Slightly later, the Fosse Way was constructed, joining Exeter, Ischia, Dumnoniorum in Devon with Lindum. This passed through what later became Newark and is more or less the route of the modern A46. The roads were built by Roman legions, who had their own surveyors, engineers and the equipment required for this type of construction work. Local conditions and availability of materials dictated how the road would be constructed locally, but the basic principles were always the same. The road took the form of an embankment raised above the level of the surrounding land, with drainage ditches on either side. It was built up in a series of layers comprising a foundation of large rocks, followed by smaller stones, gravel and sand laid down in successive layers and rammed into place. A cobbled surface was common in towns or areas of heavy use, but usually it would be gravel. The embankment was cambered for drainage, often 10 metres or 33 feet or more wide. It was rarely less than 3 metres, 9.5 feet wide, to allow room for two-wheeled vehicles to pass. Roman roads in Britain were built as straight as possible, as shown by the aerial photograph of the Fosse Way in Warwickshire. In Nottinghamshire, small towns were built alongside the Fosse Way. From Rate Curial Tavorum, modern Leicester, Vernamatum, near Willoughby on the Wolds, was 13 Roman miles. Next was Margidunum, near Bingham, a further 12 miles, followed by Pontem, near Thorpe, East Stoke, another 7 miles further, then Crockacalana, Brough, another 7 miles, before the Fosse Way ended at Lindham in modern Lincoln. These names and distances are known from an early 3rd century Antonine itinerary, which lists 225 road routes in the Roman Empire. This has helped identify each site. There was also a settlement at Newark, although it isn't named in any sources. At both ends of this stretch of the Fosse Way, major Roman towns developed at Leicester and Lincoln, with all the trappings of a Romanised way of life: temples, a forum, basilica, and public baths. The remains of some of these can still be seen in both modern cities. Lindham had originally been built and garrisoned by the 9th Legion Hispania, which moved north to found the fortress at York in 71 AD. Towards the end of the 1st century, Lincoln became a colonia, a place where army veterans who had served for 25 years were given a plot of land to settle down on. There were only 4 colonia in Britain, the first at Colchester, then Lincoln, Gloucester, and finally York. The modern name for Lincoln comes from the ironade Lindum and Roman colonia being joined together. As the military campaign moved north, the peace led some to embrace a Romanised way of life in the towns, and from the 2nd century in villa sites. The Trent Valley was fertile and heavily occupied. Aerial photographs since 1945 have revealed a 15-kilometre long densely occupied strip of land from Newark to Normanton-on-Trent. Most settlements were on the west bank of the Trent at Kelham, South Muscombe, North Muscombe, Carlton-on-Trent, Sutton-on-Trent and Normanton-on-Trent. On the east bank, crop marks reveal settlements at Winthorpe, Home, Collingham and Besthorpe. There was also a marching camp at Home, presumably from when the army had crossed the Trent and were moving north. Villas were built at Mansfield Woodhouse, Southwell, Cromwell and just across the Lincolnshire border at Norton Disney. We will now look at some of the roadside sites in more detail. Margidunum was the subject of 2 main series of digs, the first being conducted by Felix Oswald, who excavated between 1910 and 1936, recovering scores of intact artefacts and thousands of broken fragments, including a mass of pottery which he reassembled into complete vessels wherever possible as he went along. The larger items included cooking pots, urns, storage jars and metalware such as iron weapons, a fire gridiron, large keys and door hinges. One large piece of tile still bore the clear imprint of a hobnail Roman shoe, and the complete flue brick was evidence that at least some of Margidunum's residents had enjoyed central heating. Many of these objects were transferred to Nottingham University Archaeological Museum, where they can be seen today. Work in the 1960s revised some of Oswald's earlier conclusions. Further excavations took place during the A46 dueling work, where further buildings and burials were found. The Roman fort seems to have been superseded by a sprawling, defended town which was occupied at least into the late 4th century. At Pontem near Thorpe on the Fosse Way, just north of East Stoke, this was a small 1st century military garrison that later became a larger defended town. The name appears to refer to a bridge over the River Trent, although no trace of a bridge has ever been found. It was excavated by Hadrian Oswald in 1937 and 38. Aerial photographs in the 1950s revealed the outlines of at least 3 overlapping structures, 2 rectangular and 1 oval. The rounded corners of the oval structure are typical of a Roman military fort. A larger civilian settlement built in the 2nd century was surrounded by a ditch around 6 metres broad. In the 3rd to 4th century, a much larger settlement was enclosed by rectangular stone walls 2.6 metres thick and surrounded by 2 ditches. Crockacalana at Brough on the A46 has only been excavated once, in 1903 to 1905 by T. Cecil Smith Woolley. Originally all the finds were taken to his house in Collingham, which was said to resemble a small museum. Eventually they were donated to the Newark Museum and they remain either in store at the Resource Centre or on display at the National Civil War Centre. Aerial photographs showed that it was a small, roughly rectangular town defended by deep ditches 6 to 10 metres across, which enclosed around 17 acres. No military presence has been identified, however it has not been excavated using modern techniques. Around 130 coins dating from the 1st to 4th centuries were found and became known as Bruff pennies. Woolley found the foundations of a wall 1.5 metres thick with painted wall plaster still attached, fragments of which are shown. In 1940, following heavy ploughing, a lump of metal was seen sticking out of the field. It was reported as an unexploded bomb, but when excavated it was found to be a Roman lead coffin. In 1971, 15-year-old John Hart, using the metal detector, found 2 further lead coffins. One of these contained the almost complete human remains of an individual who was around 5 feet 8 inches in height. Given the height, it was assumed the remains were of a male. However, 20 years later they were examined again and found to belong to a 17 to 23-year-old female who had been pregnant at least once. This coffin and the human remains are currently on display in the Newark galleries, and you can have a go and interact to see if you will make the same mistake in identifying the human remains as male or female. Lead coffins are reasonably rare, so the fact that there were 3 buried at Crocker along with the decorated wall plaster tells us something about the wealth of the people living in the town. There have been some suggestions that, like Margidunum, it may have been a mansione, a staging place for the Imperial Post. Despite no military presence being observed, the most spectacular find was a copper alloy cavalry helmet cheekpiece. It is probably my favourite object in the museum's collection. It was the lower right-hand side of a parade helmet, as it is far too ornate to have been worn in battle. The Crosby Garrett helmet found in Cumbria is an example of these. It is thought that the male figure is either Castor or Pollux, brothers of Helen of Troy, who became known as the Dioscuri and can be seen in the night sky as the astrological heavenly twins Gemini. In his right hand he holds a spear, and in the left the reins of his horse. Castor and Pollux were some of the gods associated with the Roman auxiliary cavalry. The auxiliaries, unlike the legionaries, were not Roman citizens and were drawn from across the empire, from places such as Spain, Germany and Dacia, modern Romania. Both the auxiliaries and legionaries would have brought their families with them, along with traders from across the empire. Many of the urban areas would have been nearly as multicultural as our cities today. A tombstone at Arbea in South Shields commemorates the British wife of a merchant from Palmyra in today's Syria. Intriguingly, the cheekpiece has been pierced in 2 places. Was this a form of ritual putting it out of use before it was buried? What became Newark was at the junction of the Fosse Way and an important local road in use since long before the Romans arrived, known as Shoestone Lane. This ran for 11.5 miles from Thistleton on Ermine Street towards Long Bennington and then to Balderton. It is now thought that Newark had 2 periods of Roman occupation. The first, in the late 1st to early 2nd century, had a high status or military character, with a second civilian settlement in the 3rd to 4th centuries. In the late 19th to early 20th century, coins and pottery had been found around the Spittal site on Northgate, particularly during the excavations for the Warwick and Richardson Brewery in 1898, when a bronze bracelet and almost complete jug were found. In the 20th century, small-scale excavations found further evidence, and in 2003, excavation in advance of building Northgate Retail Park found 3rd to 4th century jewellery, pottery and human remains. Excavation in the Millgate 5th to 7th century Anglo-Saxon cemetery found 4 reused Roman pots amongst 300 plus cremation burials, and archaeologists have suggested that these may have come from the Northgate site. A settlement built between the Fosse Way and the River Trent would seem the logical place to benefit from the trade coming along either route. Roman artefacts have also been recovered from other sites in the town, with an oil lamp found on the site of the Devon Brewery on Barmbygate. In the local area, villas have been recorded at Southwell, Carcolston, Thurgerton and Epperstone, Cromwell, and just across the Lincolnshire border at Norton Disney. Further north at Mansfield Woodhouse, a winged villa with impressive mosaics were found in the late 18th century. Villas appear to have been a statement of wealth and Romanisation by the elite Romano-British. They came in various shapes and sizes, some with their own bathhouses and mosaic floors, others much simpler. The Southwell villa was probably the largest in the region, was estimated to be 73 metres by 91 metres when excavated in 1959. The best known mosaic is a swimming Cupid that had once been on the walls above a cold bath. It can be seen today in Southwell Minster. Excavation of the former Minster School site in 2008 discovered a large stone-built wall that was remarkably well preserved, surviving for at least 20 metres in length and 3 courses high. Roman specialist Dr. Will Belden from the University of Nottingham has commented that this wall, with its massive sandstone blocks, recalls urban Roman public building, and it's highly unusual in a villa. Despite the speculation that it relates to a temple or other major monument, its purposes remain unclear. However, it is likely that it was a retaining terrace wall built to impress those approaching the villa. The possible extent of the villa can be seen on the aerial view. Southwell Community Archaeological Group continue to investigate Roman sites both in and around Southwell. The museum collection houses a large amount of artefacts from the Norton Disney Villa, which was not far from Crocacolana on Potter's Hill. It was excavated in the 1930s by Hadrian Oswald, who discovered a large wing building that houses a hypocaust heating system, a bath suite, mosaics, and possibly had a separate entrance gatehouse. It developed over several rebuilding phases following a series of fires and enjoyed its high point between 300 and 360. Wall plaster and several mosaics were still in situ. The Antiquities Journal featured a full report in 1937. The mosaic floors were too large to remove, and Newark Museum had no space to display them, so they were covered over, although representations were removed and are either on display at the Civil War Centre or in store. Also found were collapsed roof tiles and plaster mouldings, which have been reconstructed. Many artefacts were found here, including a large globular amphora with the maker's name stamped into the handle. It was made in Spain and would have contained olive oil. The photographs show it as it was found and then once it had been reconstructed. A leather shoe, which was conserved recently at the University of Lincoln, a charged jet bangle, and a bone-handled knife are all evidence of life in the villa. Other objects include the stylus for writing on wax tablets. The other end is flat, so that once the message on the tablet had been read, the wax could be smoothed flat so a reply could be written. This is so different from the stylus we use on tablets or smartphones today. Below it is an enamelled seal box. The lid is hinged and has 4 holes underneath to take the strings for securing a package. Once tied, wax could be melted on top and an intaglio ring used to make an impression in the wax before the lid was closed. Whoever received it would then know it hadn't been tampered with before delivery. These were only in use in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Another intriguing object was this silver object, with a scoop at one end and a leaf-shaped point at the other. For many years it was described as an ear scoop for removing earwax, but there was no explanation for the other end. When we were working on a British Museum-led project a few years ago, I found a photograph of an almost identical object found in a kitchen context. We now think it would have been used for eating seafood. The scoop could be used for extracting meat from crab claws, whilst a sharp end could be used for extracting whelks or winkles from their shells. Other enigmatic objects include a fragment of faced pot with a trident on its forehead, found at Brough, and the Hunt Cup with 2 hounds hunting a deer found at Thorpe. The Hunt Cup is made from Trent Valley ware from around the Peterborough area. Domestic items include storage jars, dishes, and strainer jars. Distinctive high-quality tableware known as Samian ware has been found at Brough and at Norton Disney. This was made in Gaul, and some of the potter's workshops are known from the stamps on the bases. They are often decorated with foliage, animal, human, or mythological figures in relief. The Romans were very good at taking whatever god was worshipped locally and equating it with one of their own. A good example of this is at modern Bath. The large natural hot spring was dedicated to the Celtic god Sulis. The Romans equated Sulis with their goddess Minerva and encouraged her worship. The Roman name for the town was Aqua Sulis, the waters of Sulis. In the East Midlands, over 70 fingerings have been found bearing the letters T-O-T. All date to the 2nd or 3rd century. This is short for Tutatis, a Gallic god paired with both Mars and Mercury. The name translates as tribal protector and appears to have been worshipped for his protective powers over the former Corleotorvi territory in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Most have been found in Lincolnshire, but we have several in our own collection like the one shown. In the 4th century, Christianity was first recognised by the Emperor Constantine in 313, before becoming Rome's official religion in 380. One object that speaks of Christianity's spread is the fragment of lead casket found at Pontem, Thorpe. It has the Chi Rho symbol, with Chi and Rho being the first 2 letters of the Greek spelling of Christ. Although they can't be seen on the photograph, there are 2 female figures either side of the inscription. Whether angels or mother goddesses is unclear. The inscription should read Uteri Felix, which can be translated as use me happily. It has been misspelt with the F of Felix being another E. It's been interpreted as either a font for Christian baptism or a casket for wedding gifts, giving the use me happily translation. Intriguingly, a more complete lead tank was found in 1998 at Floorborough, only a few miles from Thorpe. This also had the same Uteri Elix misspelling, so if the maker was the same person, he still hadn't learnt his Latin. It can be seen in Nottingham University's Archaeological Museum. The end of the Roman occupation of Britain is taken as being 410, when the Emperor Honorius wrote a letter to towns in the province telling them to take precautions on their own behalf. There had been a gradual decline in the Roman Empire, with civil wars and attacks by Germanic tribes, meaning it could no longer defend its provinces. Many of the villa sites were abandoned in the late 4th century. Raids by the Picts of what became Scotland and the Irish Scotti in the northern province added to the threat of Germanic Saxon attacks on the east coast. Following the Roman withdrawal, the Romans' way of life gradually collapsed, and some of the Saxon raiders began to settle. Coin hoards from this period of uncertainty are quite common, although this coin is of the Emperor Hadrian and part of the hoard of silver denarii found at Ollerton. There is some debate over whether the Romans employed Germanic warriors as mercenaries rather than there being a Saxon invasion, but the arrival of the Saxons and later the Vikings is part of next week's look at Newark's history. There are thousands of Roman artefacts in the museum's collection, so this presentation has looked at just a few of the total. If you would like to learn more about Roman Nottinghamshire, I recommend Mark Patterson's book, which just happens to have my favourite object on the front cover.